Royal Guard. Since its advent in Devil May Cry 3, this mechanic has been pushing the boundary of the perfect block. It's like if FF7 didn't shoehorn mandatory perfect guarding into every fight. You don't have to Royal Guard, which is what makes it so cool when you actually do. But that begs the question, can you go through all of DMC5 with nothing but Royal Guard? Real quick, before we start, I want to remind you about subscribing. It helps the channel so much and shows that you really enjoy the stuff I'm putting out. So, if you're not familiar with DMC5 on PC, this is gonna look a little bit weird. Normally, you don't get to play as Dante until Mission 10, but thanks to a mod called Cyan's Collaborative Cheat Trainer, we can choose to play as any character at any given mission. I'm playing the game on Dante Must Die difficulty on a completely fresh save file. This means I have no upgrades to my name at the start, which equates to the minimum possible amount of health and Devil Trigger, plus an extremely neutered Royal Guard style. And since I typically never address how I'm able to play on DMD, the hardest difficulty in the game, from a new save file, I figure I'd quickly touch on that here. This is Urizen. You fight him in the prologue mission of the game, and you're not supposed to win. But if you manage to beat him, you trigger a secret ending that unlocks the next difficulty as though you've progressed through all 21 missions. So for example, doing this on Devil Hunter unlocks Son of Sparta, and then doing it again on the newly acquired difficulty grants access to DMD. As for the red orbs gained along the way, I spent them on some worthless items I won't use and began my run at 0. Now let's touch upon the titular Royal Guard and what that's all about. There are two types of blocks, a normal one, which I'll sometimes refer to as a chump block, and a perfect block, which indicates you timed the button press nigh perfectly. Both of these blocks fill up the Royal gauge in proportion to the damage prevented. However, a normal guard will consume your Devil Trigger or DT in exchange for preventing the damage that you would have taken. In contrast, a perfect block actually gives you DT while negating damage. To get a proper Royal Guard, you need to press the button and have the enemy attack connect within a 5-frame window, otherwise it'll just be a normal guard. There's also a Royal Release, which is how you actually send that absorbed damage back at the enemy. You can do a normal release at any point, which simply has Dante punch at the foe, but if you time your release within that 5-frame Royal Guard window, you'll get a perfect release that amplifies your damage and looks flashy as heck. As you might expect, more aggressive enemies means more damage for me to absorb and send back at them, which is what made this encounter full of the least aggressive enemies ever such a pain. On some attempts, if I was lucky, the flying foe would get caught in the Royal Release collateral. Other times, I had to stand around and wait for the slowest attacks in existence. But wait, if I cleared the encounter, why did I have to do it multiple times? Because there's no checkpoint between this first fight and the second one where I had to challenge Tanya, Queen of the Impusa. With such low health against one of the highest damaging basic enemies in the game, I was in trouble unless I played perfectly. And trust me, I didn't play perfectly. I spent the next 3 hours getting beat and making my way back to taste the cement all over again. But eventually, I chipped away at the wall, using taunts to keep my Devil Trigger high for healing or safe blocking, and then I got familiar enough with the Queen's timings that I finally broke through. Beating that encounter basically meant I was done with the mission, and every time I had failed and restarted the mission, the game let me keep the red orbs I had amassed from my previous attempts. But the shop didn't open until you beat mission 1, so we were gonna have to take on the first boss with no upgrades. Being an unassuming houseplant, you wouldn't think much of this boss, but after losing a chunk of its health, it summons a friend who was easily looped with Royal Releases. The plant's pokes were easy enough to guard, but its sweeps had a bit of a strange timing that took some adjusting to. And if I ever just needed a breather, walking to the back of the arena meant that the boss literally couldn't touch me. And as a reward for fisting the fern, Nico opened up her shop to me. I immediately bought 3 purple orbs for extra DT, upgraded Royal Guard all the way to level 4, and got Trigger Heart to make that DT go even farther. Now that our style was maxed, we had access to a few new fun tools. The first thing you'll notice is that instead of 4 bars of damage to store, I've got a full circle of 10, so I can dish out an absurd counterattack if I stock up enough. Then there's Royal Revenge, a move that only consumes 1 bar from the Royal Guard gauge to automatically counter any attack in response to damage. I could use that to preserve the rest of my gauge if the enemy was low, and hitting an enemy with it also refunded a fair bit of DT, so it was a great utility to take advantage of. I was also granted access to the ability to block in the air, and if you know anything about Royal Guard and DMC, jumping and pressing the block button makes good things happen. I'll touch on the specifics of that when it becomes more relevant later though. For a majority of the run, the bosses were actually the easy part, while the normal encounters proved insanely dangerous. It's much easier to block huge telegraphed single attacks compared to several smaller simultaneous blows coming at you from different angles. But that's the cool thing about Royal Guard. It's both good in one-on-one combat and great for dealing with crowds. A Royal Release can easily pierce every foe in its path, dishing out 10 billion points of damage to anyone unfortunate enough to touch it. Oh, and you can get some silly interactions like this. Speaking of fun things you can do in the Goliath boss fight, if you perfect release his AoE, it lasts long enough for you to chain 3 releases together and cheat out just a bit of extra damage. In a hilarious twist, I was forced to spend some orbs on upgrading Trickster to level 2 so that I could teleport to these Grim Grips, otherwise progression was completely impossible. Mission 3 has one of, if not the hardest encounter in the game, featuring 4 lizardmen and a magic man. There's an explosive barrel in the middle of the room that can set any foe in its radius to 1 health, and I just so happened to catch 3 of the Riots and the Lusakia with it. So after double tapping each of them, I only had 1 full health reptile to manage, which also provided a nice opportunity to learn its guard timings for future encounters. So, you know how I just talked about bosses being the easy part? That actually only applies to bosses that don't have infinitely respawning enemies in their fight. Artemis sends out her pre-programmed chest turrets to shoot you down, and either way I handled them felt wrong. If I ignored them, I took way too much— my arm! Oh, that hurt. Oh. If I ignored them, I took way too much damage and had to restart the fight. But if I destroyed them, the boss pretty much instantly brought them back. So I chose the secret third option: decimate one of them and keep the other one around. This way, the boss couldn't summon more and I only had to deal with half of the threats. Another huge boon was Artemis's flyby attack. If it connects, it only hits you once, but if you guard it, you actually get 4 or 5 blocks. That's thanks to a neat wind mechanic meant to make you flinch if the actual damaging blow missed you. As a result, if you get a perfect block on the initial hit, you'll automatically guard against the following wind currents and gain an absurd amount of Devil Trigger in return. I used the DT from that to keep myself healed up and chump blocked all the small hits till I had enough meter to slap the boss. One thing that should have been scary is her giant spirit bomb that nobody has ever actually seen. But in the end, you can just hold the block button. It doesn't even take that much DT. In the next mission, I found out that behemoths are an absolute slog to guard, so I went back and purchased Enemy Step. This ability lets me bounce on the heads of my foes, and for a successful bounce, I was rewarded a small bit of DT. By gaining my meter through jumping, I could spend it to just hold block instead of trying to time Behemoth's funky attacks. This Mario lifestyle afforded me so much extra safety and alternative ways to handle every encounter moving forward. And sure, it was kinda slow just jumping on enemies over and over, but what's even slower is taking an L and restarting from checkpoint. I began the Nidhogg fight trying to play up close and personal, and that just wasn't working out. But this boss has an interesting quirk that I was able to take advantage of. Once the orange man leaves the field, he doesn't come back until one of his 3 tentacles has been dispatched. This gave me ample time to devise a proper strategy. By standing at the very back of the arena, the tentacles would perform the same pattern over and over again. The middle head would thrust at me and the other 2 would shoot out their goop. Since it was so predictable, nailing the guard timing for these hits didn't take long. Then I used Royal Revenge to deal damage while maintaining a majority of my meter so I could pump everything everything I was storing up into Nidhogg himself when he came back to the field. As it turns out, the lizards back in the sewers of Mission 3 prepared me for this close quarters combat against Jimmy, Timmy, Kimmy, and Paul. What it could never have prepared me for is the final fight before the boss against two nobodies. This enemy is unique in the fact that once it takes enough punishment to the face, either its mask falls off or it decides to replace the current one with a new one. These beasts start with one equipped and only have two others to swap to. Once they're all gone, the monster completely pacifies. That's really bad for me because I get my damage from them hitting me. I was hoping it wouldn't come to this, but let's talk about empty releases. You can technically deal damage with an empty tank, but it's actually abysmal, and I take umbrage in the fact that I even had to do it here. By the way, doing the entire game with nothing but empty releases is probably the challenge run I get suggested the most, and hopefully this visual here can help elaborate on why I will never do this run. It's not interesting, it's not fun, and it's not rewarding. It's boring, uninspired, and repetitive to no end. I decided to time this for fun, by the way, and it took 49 minutes to take this guy to 0 health. Just food for thought. Moving on, it's finally time to explain jump guarding. This is the process of using the invulnerability you get from a jump to artificially facilitate a perfect royal guard. By pressing the block button mid-jump, you cancel your invulnerability to go into block frames, and if you use your jump frames to dodge an attack, you will immediately negate the damage the second you press the block button, essentially forcing your way into a royal guard or release. Garyan Knight's large sweeps were perfect for this technique, like a match made in heaven. And like all gift horses, I jumped up and punched it in the mouth. Wait, what do you mean that's not how to say it? I got to guard against a giant drifting car, so that was an experience. And then I took on these guys while having Nikke lore being explained to me. Midway through Mission 8, I managed to beat another nobody into passivity again, meaning I lost another 30 minutes. But after that, I found out Royal Revenge was surprisingly effective against Urizen's crystal. As I pressed further and further into the game, the general power level of the encounters was increasing, meaning more aggressive enemies, and more aggressive enemies translates to me stockpiling damage more quickly, which resulted in quicker battles. The trickier fights along my path also had ways for me to ice out the deadlier enemies if I needed some breathing room. Unfortunately, this mission ended with a fight against 3 nobodies, and I had a feeling I already knew where this was headed. But in a stroke of good luck, I managed to finish off the final nobody without it losing its mask thanks to a chunky full release. Following my lucky break, I met up with the boys from Mission 7 and tried telling them all about the Nikke lore I had learned. I don't think they were very interested though, because they all left before I was finished explaining why the penguin had a gun. So I followed them into the next mission and made sure they knew everything there was to know about Mustang and why he's actually Hanson and not evil anymore. Jump guarding proved fruitful once more against the exact same boss I fought before, minus the horse. There is a way to skip most encounters in Mission 12 by doing some sick jumps, but only using Royal Guard, I wasn't able to do any of them, so for the first time in a very long time, I went the normal route. This path involved me fighting 2 Furies at once, and then 2 Baphomets and a nobody, but after getting stomped in that fight, I realized I actually was able to do the skip. Oops. From here on out, a majority of encounters and bosses fell into the same loop. Guard, gain DT, repeat until release. If I had trouble getting perfect guards, it wasn't hard to keep my DT high for chump blocks, and I didn't have to incorporate anything unique into any of these fights, until the final encounter against Urizen. I was forced to play his game a little bit. Phase 1 went by without a hitch, but his second phase slowed the battle down by a lot. His magic had super awkward timings to guard, so I opted to avoid trying altogether. I exclusively dodged his spells and gained DT from enemy stepping whenever I could. Then I normal blocked until my DT got low, and repeated the process from there. Once I eventually got him low enough for his final phase transition, the fight sped up significantly because he went back to punching and kicking, something I could actually perfect guard. Now, Let me ask you something. Have you ever tried royal guarding a bird? Me neither. So this was a very new experience for the both of us. Initially, I attempted to just tough it out and learn the timings. That route had minuscule amounts of success. Test number 2 used camera manipulation to pacify the bird and gain infinite amounts of DT for normal blocking purposes. This method proved effective, but took 10 billion years to actually deal damage. So in my third experiment, I combined both of my first 2 methods. I would face the camera to the wall and taunt until my DT was full, then I would point it toward Griffin and get a mix of normal and perfect guards, granting me much more royal guard gain than method 2 while still staying safer than method 1. It was slow but interactive enough that I didn't outright pass away from old age. I basically did the same thing against Shadow, but I was able to be a bit more aggressive with my enemy steps and blocks since his attacks were easier to outright dodge than Griffin's. For the double fight, if you ignore Griffin and push Shadow below a certain health threshold, they both run away. This time I entered the battle with a full royal guard gauge that I could push into the cat right at the start. Then it was back to standing in corners and carefully whittling down the enemy. I tried my best to goad Shadow on screen while keeping Griffin passive, and then I used Royal Revenge to chip away at his health pool. By the time I got to the actual boss fight, it followed much the same formula. While Nightmare was gone, I sat in a corner and gained DT via taunts. When he was on the field, I perfect guarded his attacks and sent the damage back his way at every opportunity. At low health, he enters ball form, and I strategically kept the 2 pets alive in order to gain Royal Guard meter from them so I could finish off their boss. Virgil was a much more straightforward case. I've been perfect guarding his first phase for eons, and his second phase, once he begins using Devil Trigger, wasn't much different. The issues only began when the doppelganger came out. On its own, this thing is pretty innocuous, but when your own damage is entirely dependent on predictable and consistent patterns, it's a completely different story. The random attacks Doppel would send my way threw off my dodging, my block timings, and even my lock-on. I had to make this guy a goner as soon as possible. But he didn't stay gone for long. Now, the second time Virgil summoned the doppelganger, he deleted himself by doing a specific attack. I don't really know the specifics on that, but once he got summoned for the third time, he was here to stay. I needed enough Royal Guard meter to take it out with a single decisive blow, and my openings weren't getting any bigger. So I laid it all on the line and chump blocked a series of judgment cuts, with the last one breaking my guard and leaving me vulnerable. Thankfully, nothing else came my way and I was able to recover, promptly using the meter I just got to take out the doppelganger once and for all. Back to a one-on-one, my health was still terrifyingly low, but I locked in and finished the job before Virgil could call for backup again. My reward? Doing it all over again. Mission 20 Virgil features less health regeneration and less frequent doppelganger summoning, so I had a much easier time. The fight was way less of an uphill battle, and before I knew it, that was it. The game had just been beaten with nothing but Royal Guard. So, while it does require the use of a mod to actually beat DMC5 with nothing but Royal Guard, it is possible. Overall, the run was a fun time, but I can't deny that there were some extremely tedious situations that cropped up. I definitely could have done without them, but what are you gonna do? Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Sayonara.